Hello. During this lesson, we'll focus on the feedback loops in non-gravid female reproductive systems, so non-pregnant females. And we'll start with the first phase of the ovarian cycle. So the menstrual cycle for females averages 28 days, and it consists of the ovarian cycle, which is 3 stages, and we'll begin with the follicular phase as the first phase. This phase varies in length and can last up to 3 weeks. It begins at the end of the menses, where the uterine lining is shed. So in this phase, you'll see that there are 3 hormone control centers. We have the hypothalamus, which releases gonadotropin hormone. Then we have the pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary releases LH and FSH, and then the ovary itself would be here. These 2 cells are actually part of the follicle, and the ovary also releases hormones. So low levels of estrogen are detected, which then stimulates a positive feedback loop by the granulosa cells to produce more estrogen. We can also see that there's an inhibitory loop that affects the secretion of LH and FSH from the anterior pituitary, and so when inhibin is secreted by granulosa cells to block these 2 from being produced, that's the way of the cell controlling how many follicles are going to be made and matured during the follicular phase. The theca cells play a role in producing androgens, and androgens are also found in males, but in females androgens are converted by an enzyme aromatase to create estrogen. So that's the estrogen production, and then as estrogen production increases, we will then be able to move on to the next phase of the cycle. Also not noted on this diagram, granulosa cells also produce a hormone called AMH, anti-Müllerian hormone, which also acts to keep too many follicles from maturing at the same time. Just a note here, birth control actually works in this phase to keep estrogen high and prevents ovulation from moving forward, so that's just a clinical application. As we move on to the late follicular phase and begin with ovulation, this is the second stage of the ovarian cycle where we see a peak in hormones. This is where fertilization will take place, but since we are talking about non-gravid female reproduction, that will not occur. At the end of the follicular phase that we previously saw, the theca cells produce androgens that will trigger the release of estrogen, and it will also trigger the release of progesterone and inhibin from the granulosa cells. So estrogen will actually switch to a positive feedback on the gonadotropin hormone, which then will cause the anterior pituitary to secrete more LH and FSH. Specifically, LH production increases dramatically, and this is called the LH surge, and this stimulates the beginnings of ovulation. FSH doesn't increase as much because it is blocked by the negative feedback from the release of inhibin in the granulosa cells, and progesterone plays a role by inducing a positive feedback that will continue the production of LA. So here it just shows that estrogen is contributing to ovulation, but progesterone also plays a role. So LH and FSH will help stimulate the release of the oocyte from the ovary, and then we will go from there. So next we'll move on to the luteal phase, which is the third stage of the ovarian cycle. In this stage, we're going from the point of ovulation where hormone levels were extremely high, and this will stimulate high levels of hormone stimulate a negative feedback loop to start to decrease the production of FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone. Thecal cells and granulosa cells of the follicle that we previously saw are actually converted into the corpus luteum, as we see here. This will work to secrete more estrogen and progesterone that initiates this feedback loop. As you can see, at the end of the luteal phase, we start to see a drop off in the level of hormones that are being secreted. The endothelium begins to thicken in preparation for menses. The corpus luteum towards the end of this actually starts to die via apoptosis, and the negative feedback loop that we saw in the previous slide in the early luteal phase is actually removed so that the follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone can begin to be produced again. So during this phase, there are no positive or negative feedback loops present. The decrease in the estrogen and progesterone will continue decreasing and stay the same until the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle begins again, and then they start to prepare for another menstrual cycle and ovulation. Here's a summary slide that shows the entire process. We see this was taken from our textbook Silverthorne, and it shows the stages and the feedback loops and the hormones and their effects on the female reproductive cycle. So we'll start with the early mid-follicular phase, then we transition into ovulation and the luteal phase. That's broken down into two parts. One where we see negative feedback loops that inhibit FSH and LH from being released, and then we see the removal of that feedback loop to return it to normal conditions. You can clearly see the length of each cycle through this diagram at the top, how the first stage and the third stage are relatively long in length, but the ovulation is fairly short. It's only a few days in the menstrual cycle. In the follicular phase, so just to reiterate, we see that there are negative and positive feedback loops contribute to follicular growth, and the follicle grows to an antrum that we see here, which is a cell that develops on the inside of the granulosa layer of the follicle that contains more hormones that will then contribute to ovulation. During ovulation, we see this is a much briefer period, like I said, and there are also positive and negative feedback mechanisms that contribute to the release of hormones from the thecal and granulosa cells, and which will then, at the end of this stage, these cells in the follicle will turn into the corpus luteum when the ovum is no longer viable, and so in the non-pregnant female. As you see in the luteal phase, negative feedback mechanisms work to degenerate the corpus luteal cells, and we'll start to see the lining of the uterus increase and then decrease, as you see here. So as we see through this slide in this lecture, the female reproduction system is fairly complex, and the hormones play a extremely complicated and vital role in the regulation of the female menstrual cycle.